Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
At our anniversary dinner, my mother-in-law smirked and said, "Well, I bet you didn't expect to last this long." My husband took a slow sip of wine, set his glass down carefully, and replied, "Yeah, especially after what you told me the night before the wedding." She choked mid-swallow, her face twitching in shock for just a second before she quickly composed herself, dabbing at her mouth with a linen napkin as if nothing had happened. But I saw it, the flicker of panic in her sharp, calculating eyes. The restaurant noise around us faded into a distant hum as my heart slammed against my ribs, my body suddenly alert in a way that felt almost primal. I glanced at my husband, waiting for some kind of explanation, but Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the deep red wine swirling in his glass. The way his fingers tightened around the stem, the barely perceptible shift in his posture, told me that this was no harmless comment. Something had been said, something important, something I should have known years ago. My pulse hammered as I turned back to Evelyn, my mother-in-law, the woman who had never truly welcomed me into her family, despite the careful mask of politeness she always wore in public. "What the hell did you say to him?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. The words cut through the elegant atmosphere of the dimly lit restaurant, making the people at the next table shift uncomfortably. Evelyn smiled, that same practiced, condescending little curve of her lips that always made me want to throw something heavy through a window. She adjusted the pearl necklace around her throat, tilting her head just slightly as if she were about to deliver a well-rehearsed monologue. "Oh, honey," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "if only you knew." She gave a little chuckle, taking another sip of her drink as though this conversation was nothing more than idle dinner chatter, but I saw the way her fingers trembled slightly as she set the glass down. I turned back to Daniel, my heart pounding now, waiting no, demanding an answer. But my husband, the man I had spent the last 7 years of my life with, the man who had promised me honesty, loyalty, and love, just sat there, silent. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the tablecloth. I could barely breathe. "Daniel," I said again, my voice quieter now but far more dangerous, "what did she tell you?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt the first real crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Evelyn let out another one of those soft, smug little laughs, reaching for a piece of bread from the basket in the center of the table, deliberately tearing it apart as if she were dissecting something weak and helpless. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said airily. It was just a little heart-to-heart between a mother and her son. "You know, a few words of wisdom before he made the biggest mistake of his life." I stared at her, my skin prickling with rage. "Mistake?" I repeated, my voice laced with something sharp, something dangerous. "You told him marrying me was a mistake?" Evelyn gave a small shrug, taking her time as she buttered her bread, her movements deliberately slow, calculated. "I simply told him to consider all the facts," she said, biting into it without breaking eye contact with me, "to make sure he truly knew what he was getting himself into." I felt my hands shaking in my lap, but I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe, to not let her see how deeply her words were cutting into me. I could feel the weight of Daniel's silence pressing down on me, suffocating, unbearable. I turned to him once more, my voice barely above a whisper. "What facts, Daniel?" For a moment, just a brief moment, I thought he was finally going to tell me. His mouth parted, his throat worked, but then his eyes flicked to his mother, and I saw it, the hesitation, the fear, the doubt. And that was what made my stomach drop. Evelyn knew. Whatever she had told him, whatever poison she had dripped into his ear the night before our wedding, it had been enough to make him question everything about me. And the worst part? He hadn't told me. He had carried that doubt, that hidden knowledge, through every kiss, every argument, every anniversary, through every single moment of our marriage. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted, like I was no longer standing on solid footing. "I think we should enjoy our dinner," Evelyn said, picking up her wine glass again, tilting it slightly as she examined the deep red liquid inside. No need to dig up old ghosts, is there? My stomach twisted. Old ghosts. The words echoed in my mind, over and over, pressing against the back of my skull like a warning, like a memory trying to claw its way to the surface. Daniel still hadn't answered me. I set my silverware down carefully, deliberately, folding my hands together on the table to keep them from trembling. No, I said slowly, my eyes locked onto Evelyn's, watching for any flicker of weakness, any hint of the truth buried beneath her smug expression. I think we should dig. For the first time since the conversation began, Evelyn faltered. Just a flicker. A moment of hesitation, so brief that if I hadn't been watching her so closely, I would have missed it. I smiled then, slow and sharp, because now I knew. She didn't want me to know what she had said to Daniel. And that meant I was going to find out. No matter what it took. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, fingers still wrapped around the stem of his wine glass, his eyes darting between me and his mother as if calculating the exact amount of damage he was about to unleash into our already unraveling evening. I could feel the tension thick in the air, a tangible weight pressing down on my chest as I waited, pulse hammering, for him to finally open his mouth and tell me what the hell was going on. But he hesitated, as if the words lodged in his throat were too heavy, as if whatever his mother had said to him that night still held power over him even after all these years. I could see Evelyn watching him with a cool, unreadable expression, her lips just barely curled into that ever-present smirk, the one that always made me feel like I was a child playing a game I didn't understand. She wasn't just waiting for him to speak, she was daring him to, challenging him with nothing more than the sharp glint in her eyes. And that was the moment I realized something that made my blood run cold. Whatever she had told him, it hadn't just been some fleeting comment meant to plant a seed of doubt, some vague warning thrown out in the heat of the moment. No, this was something bigger, something deeper, something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the night before our wedding, rotting slowly, poisoning everything between us without me even knowing it. I straightened in my chair, refusing to let my voice shake, refusing to let either of them see just how much this was starting to terrify me. Daniel, I said slowly, deliberately, my fingers pressing into the tablecloth beneath them. Tell me. Right now. He exhaled heavily, his shoulders sinking as he finally met my eyes, and for a split second, I saw something in them that made my stomach clench, a flicker of regret, maybe, or guilt, or something even worse. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. She told me, he said quietly, voice thick, that you weren't who you said you were. For a long moment, I just stared at him, trying to process the weight of those words, the sheer absurdity of them, the way they wrapped around me like a noose I hadn't even realized had been tightening for years. I could feel Evelyn's gaze burning into the side of my face, her presence like a shadow stretching across the table between us, and suddenly, it was like the restaurant, the other diners, the clinking of silverware and low murmur of voices. All of it ceased to exist. There was only this moment, only this revelation, only this ugly, gaping hole opening beneath my feet. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands now gripping the edge of the table as I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out quieter than I wanted it to. What does that even mean? Daniel shifted again, glancing briefly at his mother, as if asking permission to continue, which only made my pulse pound harder with barely contained rage. She gave a slight nod, like a queen granting an audience, and that small, insignificant gesture filled me with such a violent, visceral hatred that I had to resist the urge to reach across the table and wipe that smug look right off her face. It means, Evelyn said, her voice sickeningly smooth, that I did a little digging, dear. And what I found was very interesting. My entire body went rigid, my mind racing through every possible secret she could have uncovered, every possible piece of my past she could have twisted into something ugly and damning. I had nothing to hide, no skeletons lurking in my closet, no deep, dark past filled with hidden crimes or betrayals. But Evelyn didn't need the truth, she just needed something close enough to warp into a weapon, something she could plant in Daniel's mind like a parasite, something that would fester and eat away at the foundation of our marriage before it had even begun. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost hoarse. "She said that you had another life before me, that you were engaged before, and that..." He disappeared. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room tilted slightly, my vision narrowing, my mind struggling to reconcile the sheer insanity of what I had just heard with the reality I had been living all these years. My ex. That's what this was about. That's what she had dug up, twisted, turned into something unrecognizable, something poisonous. I could still remember the fear of that time, the way I had spent months looking over my shoulder, the way I had finally decided to disappear before he could do it first. I had left, I had changed my name, I had started over because I had to, because the alternative was something far worse. And now, years later, here she was, dragging it all back into the light, turning it into something sinister, something ugly, something that made my husband, the man I had trusted, look at me like I was a stranger. I swallowed back the nausea clawing its way up my throat, forcing myself to stay composed, to not let Evelyn see just how deeply she had hit her mark. "Tell her the rest, Daniel," Evelyn said, her voice almost gentle, almost mocking, like she was savoring every second of this moment. Daniel didn't look at her this time. He only looked at me. And the look in his eyes told me that whatever came next was going to be worse than anything I had ever imagined. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wine glass as though he needed something solid to hold on to, his gaze flickering away from mine for a fraction of a second before returning, filled with something I couldn't quite name, something that made my stomach twist with unease. I could feel the tension thick between us, the unspoken weight of whatever he was about to say pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to prepare myself for whatever was coming next. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her expression carefully composed, a satisfied gleam in her eyes as she watched the slow unraveling of the moment she had clearly been waiting for, the moment she had orchestrated so perfectly. "She told me," Daniel finally said, his voice quiet but firm, each word hitting me like a slow, deliberate blow, "that you were engaged before me, and that your ex mysteriously disappeared." For a moment, my entire body went cold, my hands gripping the edge of the table as though it was the only thing keeping me grounded, my heart hammering so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and dangerous, filling the space with something thick and suffocating, something that felt almost impossible to claw my way out of. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer weight of what he had just said, the sheer audacity of the lie Evelyn had so casually planted in his head, a lie designed to fester, to grow, to spread like poison through the very foundation of our relationship. I could see Evelyn watching me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the cracks to show, waiting for the inevitable moment when I would lash out, when I would give her exactly what she wanted, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Refused to let her see how deeply her words had cut, how much damage she had already done. My throat felt dry, my breath shallow, my mind racing through 1,000 different ways to respond, 1,000 different ways to try to undo the damage that had already been done. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice steady, forcing myself to meet Daniel's gaze head-on, forcing myself not to break. "He didn't disappear," I said slowly, carefully, the words feeling like broken glass against my tongue. "He was abusive. I left him. I changed my name to escape." Daniel blinked, his face shifting ever so slightly, the smallest flicker of something passing through his expression, surprise, maybe, or regret, or something else entirely. I didn't know whether to be relieved or furious that he hadn't immediately dismissed Evelyn's words as a lie, that he had let those seeds of doubt take root, that he had doubted me for years without ever telling me, without ever asking, without ever giving me the chance to explain. Evelyn let out a soft, condescending little laugh, shaking her head slightly as though she found my response amusing, as though she had already anticipated every single move I would make. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. that's quite the convenient story, isn't it? You run away, change your name, erase your past, and now there's no proof of anything, no way for anyone to know the truth about what really happened. I turned to her sharply, my patience snapping like a taut wire pulled too tight, my nails pressing into my palms so hard that it almost hurt. Are you serious? I demanded, my voice sharp enough to cut through the elegant hum of the restaurant, making Daniel tense slightly beside me. You dug into my past, twisted it into some sick story, and then used it to try and break up my marriage? Evelyn smiled, tilting her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, filled with nothing but calculated malice. I simply wanted my son to know what he was getting himself into, she said smoothly, her voice infuriatingly calm, as if this was all just some casual dinner conversation rather than the unraveling of years of trust, years of love, years of a marriage she had clearly never wanted to exist in the first place. I didn't want him walking blindly into something he might regret. My blood boiled beneath my skin, my fists clenching at my sides as I fought to keep my composure, fought to keep from reaching across the table and wiping that smug expression right off her face. You tried to ruin my marriage, I said, my voice lower now, more dangerous, laced with a fury I was barely keeping in check. But why? For the first time all evening, Evelyn hesitated. It was subtle, barely noticeable, just a flicker of something in her eyes, just the briefest moment of uncertainty before she quickly masked it, but I saw it, I felt it. And that was all I needed to know, that there was more to this than just her usual manipulation, more to this than just her desire to control Daniel's life, more to this than just some petty, vindictive attempt to push me out of the picture. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was going to find out. And when I did, I was going to make sure she regretted every single lie she had ever told. For a long moment, the three of us sat there in absolute silence, the tension between us thick enough to suffocate, the weight of everything that had just been said pressing down on my chest like a heavy stone. I could feel my hands shaking slightly in my lap, my nails digging into the fabric of my dress as I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, to not let Evelyn see how deeply her words had gotten under my skin. But inside, beneath the carefully controlled surface, a storm was raging, a fire burning hotter than it ever had before, because I finally understood, finally saw, what this had all been about from the very beginning. It had never just been about me. It had never been about some deep-seated suspicion or concern for Daniel's well-being. It had never been about love, never been about protection, never been about anything other than one single, undeniable fact: Evelyn hated losing control. She had spent Daniel's entire life shaping him, molding him, keeping him under the suffocating grip of her expectations, making sure that every decision he made was, in some way, dictated by her approval. And then I had come along, disrupting the careful balance of power she had spent years maintaining, pulling him further and further away from the orbit she had so carefully constructed. She hadn't just wanted me gone. She had wanted me erased, discarded, wiped from his life before I had the chance to cement my place in it permanently. I leaned forward slightly, pressing my elbows onto the table, tilting my head just enough to let her know that I was done playing this game on her terms, that I wasn't afraid of her, that I wasn't about to let her sit there and act like she still held all the cards. This was never about my past, I said slowly, deliberately, watching her expression closely, waiting for the exact moment my words would strike the nerve I knew was there. This was about the fact that you never wanted to let him go. Evelyn didn't flinch, but I saw the subtle way her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, the faintest twitch of muscle in her jaw, the quick flicker of irritation in her otherwise composed expression. She let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking her head slightly as if she found my words amusing, as if she wasn't the least bit affected, but I knew better now. I saw her now. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said smoothly, taking another slow sip of wine as if she had all the time in the world. "I only ever wanted what was best for Daniel, and frankly, I wasn't convinced that was you." I could feel Daniel stiffen slightly beside me, his shoulders tensing, his hands pressing into his lap, but I didn't look at him. This wasn't about him anymore. This was between her and me. "Is that why you tried to pay me off?" I asked, my voice even, steady, controlled, but sharp enough to cut. Before the wedding? Is that why you offered me money to walk away? This time, I saw it, the flicker of unease, the brief moment of uncertainty, the split second of panic before she quickly smoothed it over, tilting her head slightly, her lips curling into a condescending smile. You make it sound so vulgar, she said lightly, as if she wasn't the least bit ashamed, as if she truly believed she had done nothing wrong. I was simply giving you an option, dear. An opportunity to leave with a bit of dignity before things got complicated. Complicated. The word sent a surge of rage through me because I knew exactly what she had meant by it, knew exactly what she had been willing to do to make sure that I never made it down that aisle, knew exactly how far she had been willing to go to keep Daniel under her thumb. But she had underestimated me. She had assumed that I would be weak, that I would be afraid, that I would take the money and run because, in her mind, everyone had a price. She had never expected me to fight back. I sat back in my chair, crossing one leg over the other, forcing a slow, calculated smirk to spread across my lips, watching the way her eyes narrowed just slightly, the way she shifted ever so slightly in her seat as if some part of her knew what was coming next. You know, I said casually, running a finger along the edge of my wine glass, letting my voice drop just a little, just enough to make her listen. It's funny how you've spent so much time digging into my past when, all along, I've known exactly what you've been hiding. The change in her expression was subtle, but unmistakable, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched against the table, the sudden, forced casualness in the way she reached for her wine glass again, as if that simple motion could somehow disguise the way her world had just shifted beneath her. I could feel Daniel looking between us now, confusion and unease etched into every line of his face, but I didn't take my eyes off her, didn't let her escape the moment, didn't let her breathe. Evelyn smiled again, but this time, it wasn't as smooth, wasn't as effortless, wasn't as confident. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, her voice just a little too light, just a little too careful. I leaned in slightly, just enough to let her feel the weight of my next words, just enough to let her know that whatever power she thought she had in this conversation was slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. Let's talk about what you did 5 years ago, Evelyn. For the first time that night, my mother-in-law looked afraid. Evelyn's carefully composed mask of indifference cracked for the first time since this entire conversation had begun, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her wine glass, her body shifting in a way that told me she had just realized she was no longer the one in control. I could feel the weight of her stare, the subtle, almost imperceptible tension in her posture, the way her lips parted slightly before she quickly snapped them shut, clearly attempting to compose herself before I could deliver the final, inevitable blow. I had spent years enduring her quiet, calculated jabs, her passive-aggressive remarks disguised as motherly concern, her condescending glances that made it clear she had never once believed I was good enough for her son. But tonight, the power had shifted, the balance had tipped, and for the first time, she wasn't the one pulling the strings. Daniel looked between us, his confusion evident, his brow furrowed in frustration, his body tense with the knowledge that something far bigger than a simple family argument was unfolding right in front of him. His silence told me everything I needed to know. He was afraid of what I was about to say, afraid of what truths were about to be dragged into the light, afraid that whatever illusion of stability had existed in his family was about to be shattered beyond repair. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, my blood humming with the rush of knowing I had her exactly where I wanted her, the weight of my next words pressing against the back of my throat, waiting to be spoken. I took my time, deliberately reaching for my wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid slowly, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make her squirm, just long enough for her to wonder how much I actually knew. And then, finally, when I knew she couldn't take it anymore, I spoke. You know, Evelyn, I said casually, my voice smooth, controlled, filled with the kind of quiet confidence she had spent years trying to strip from me, for someone who loves to lecture people about honesty. You've done a pretty terrible job of practicing it yourself. Evelyn let out a soft, forced laugh, though I could hear the slight strain in it, could see the way her grip tightened just a little more around her glass, as though she were bracing for impact. "Oh, please," she said dismissively, waving a hand as if my words meant nothing, as if she still had the upper hand in this conversation. "If you're trying to accuse me of something, dear, you might want to come prepared with more than just vague insinuations." I smiled, slow and sharp, a kind of satisfaction settling deep in my chest as I reached into my purse, pulling out a neatly folded envelope, setting it carefully on the table between us. I didn't push it toward her, didn't make any move to force her to take it. I didn't need to. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, but I saw the way her breathing changed, the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly against the tablecloth, the way the carefully controlled mask she always wore was beginning to slip, piece by piece. "You've spent years trying to paint me as the liar, the manipulator, the woman who somehow tricked her way into this family," I continued, my voice calm, unwavering, the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but never once spilling over. "But I wonder, what would people think if they knew the truth about you? What would they say if they found out about the affair you had 5 years ago? The affair you had with your husband's best friend?" The silence that followed was deafening, stretching thick and heavy between us as the weight of my words sank in, as the realization of what I had just done began to settle into her bones. Daniel's head snapped toward his mother so fast I almost thought he might have given himself whiplash, his expression one of complete and utter shock, his mouth opening and closing as if he were struggling to form words, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Evelyn, to her credit, recovered quickly, her face smoothing back into something resembling composure, though I could see the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes, the tiniest crack in the armor she had spent so many years perfecting. "You're lying," she said, her voice quieter now, weaker, but still clinging to the desperate remnants of control. "You don't have proof of anything." I slid the envelope toward her then, tapping it once, my gaze never leaving hers. "Go ahead," I said, tilting my head slightly, my smirk widening just enough to make her know that I wasn't bluffing. "Open it." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, unfolding the paper inside, scanning the printed emails, the receipts, the text messages that left no room for doubt, no space for denial. I watched as her face drained of color, her lips parting slightly in stunned silence, her entire body going rigid as the truth hit her like a freight train. Across the table, Daniel let out a slow, measured breath, his hands falling into fists, his jaw tightening as he processed the reality of what had just been laid out in front of him. I lifted my glass then, raising it slightly in Evelyn's direction, my voice light, almost playful, but laced with enough venom to make her feel every single ounce of what she had put me through. "To honesty," I said smoothly, taking a slow sip, savoring the moment, savoring the way she looked like she might actually be sick right there at the table. Something you wouldn't recognize if it slapped you in the face. Her husband, the man who had sat quietly throughout most of the dinner, now pushed his chair back abruptly, his face dark with a mix of rage and betrayal, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "We're done," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And just like that, he was gone, walking out without another glance in her direction. Evelyn didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even breathe for a long moment, her entire world crumbling around her in real time. Daniel turned to me then, his eyes filled with regret, his voice quiet, careful. "I'm sorry," he said, the words carrying more weight than they ever had before. But I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, wasn't sure if I even wanted to. So I stood, smoothing out my dress, adjusting my purse, lifting my chin as I turned toward the door. "Let them all choke on the truth," I murmured under my breath, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as I walked away, leaving them all to drown in the wreckage Evelyn had created. Whether my marriage survived after that night was something I still wasn't sure of. But if there was one thing I did know, it was that Evelyn had finally learned what it felt like to lose.